Strategies for change, understanding what is a DPO and its importance to disability activism with Jacqui Brown.
My name's Jacqui Brown. I've been a long time. I'm nearly ready to retire now. In over 35 years in disability equality activism and stuff like that. For my sins, secretary actually of the board of ILMI, and I've been very involved in the UN Convention from the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities stage. I was involved in one of the early meetings of the human rights meetings out in New York in 1990, and that was like, the early days. So been around the houses a long time, and particularly had a big interest, I mean, still have obviously, but I was very much involved in women and girl-child issue in women and girl children under the convention. ILMI obviously is a DPO, and we're all here tonight. We've already identifying as disabled people, as activists, stuff like that. So that means we were all of this ilk as well. So the primary kind of things that look how to describe a DPO is we're right-based and right-focused organisations, and that means that we're led, directed, and governed by persons with disabilities. And I'm using the language there, persons with disabilities, because that's the language of the convention, the UN convention. In Ireland, if you're an activist, we tend to identify as disabled people purposely, because what we're meaning by that is saying we're disabled by the environment or the structures of society we're living in. Clear majority of the membership of a DPO are persons with a disability ourselves. We can be either individual organisations or umbrella or coalition organisations. And what would you think ILMI is? How would you describe it as an organisation? Is it an individual organisation, an umbrella, or a coalition organisation? Coalition of, in terms of being cross-impairment, for sure. But as an organisation, it's a standalone organisation, if you like. Well, it is a standalone organisation. It's the Independent Living Movement of Ireland, but it's a coalition of disabled people as opposed to a coalition of organisations. We don't actually have that many coalitions of disabled people. There is one, and it's very loose. It's not a legal entity, if you like, but I've been asked at the moment anyway, I'm chairing it. It's called the DPO network, and so that's disabled persons organisation, and it's a network of 5 organisations, including ILMI, and we've come together purely for one reason, and that is with a view to working together to write what's called a shadow report to the UN Convention, the government report on the UN Convention. DPOs, they can be local, so you could have a town-based one, village-based one, county. It can be national. A lot of the ones in Ireland are national, and we have an awful lot of regional ones as well, or they can be indeed be international in scope, like you big international ones like European Disability Forum. You have International Disability Alliance. That would be huge. That would include all of the UN countries as well. So you've both the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere countries involved in those. But they will be quite big organisations in those international spaces. And then the other key or third distinguishing feature about a DPO is the effective and meaningful participation of persons with disability is critical. That's what actually makes it a DPO. And that's done through our representative organisations, and it's at the heart of the convention. It's really important. That's the distinguishing feature between a DPO and what we would refer to as a service provider or a disability service provider. And that is set out in far more detail in General Comment 7. While a General Comment in and of itself does not have a legal basis, and it can't be, used in the court of law, it is a massive moral imperative. So it can be quoted, but it's not a legal basis, whereas the convention is a legal international treaty and it can be quoted and used. But not in Ireland's case, because we haven't signed the optional protocol. So, but that will be coming soon. DPOs understand the principles of the convention and how it operates and how we can use it to our benefit, because it is very disability friendly once you have support and once we work together to see how we can have it implemented in our own countries.
A little about the ratification of the UN CRPD.
we ratified, signed up to it, sorry, we signed up in 2006. Ireland was one of the leading countries in campaigning for it. And we were very lucky and still are very lucky to this day. Professor Jared Quinn, if any of you ever heard of him, the Professor of Law in Galway, NUIG, and he actually originally set up the Centre for Disability Law and Policy in NUIG, and then he was on the commission on status for people with disabilities with me, and he and I worked very closely an awful lot over the 3 years of that, and he was powerful, he really was. If we were to hand it, between us, we became colleagues with a lot of he's not a disabled person himself, but he's a father, he's a daughter with a disability. Anyway, it progressed from there. That was the reason that Ireland was a leader in progressing and signing up to the convention. But then we signed up to it, and then when it came to ratification stage, the civil servants, the public service and government started saying, oh, this really has implications for the state. It means we have to do things like and get our legislation in order and start spending money, because it is a legal document. Remember I said it's an international treaty. So there are commitments in that convention, and we were not ready for it, not a mind, whatever about money and to spend money on things. And we had two very big areas, and there were books to do with liberty and the rights and freedoms of people, and the other was around capacity legislation, the Assisted Decision Making Act, and this will be very important piece of legislation coming down the tracks now, and especially for everyone, especially for people maybe with learning disabilities, people with the mental health issue, and people that particularly things like acquired brain injury or neurological impairments, where historically, if there was a risk or they could be deemed to be incapacitated or not capable, and many people over the years, historically, like one of the core principles of charity approach to disability, unfortunately, as we know, was people being hidden away in asylums, in lock-up units, in congregation settings and things like that, and indeed, including made what's called a warder court. A warder court is where a court administrator initially overtakes your life, including money, decisions, everything come from you if you were deemed. You didn't have to be in an institution to be made a warder court. And it was very common in rural Ireland, where maybe and it's very complex. If any of you haven't read or watched or listened to John B. Keane in the Field, go there and remind yourselves. That'll give you a touch of a kind of approach.
Will preference versus best interest in relation to capacity.
Say you're in a medical setting, you're in the hospital setting, and we've all done it, I'm sure. You go into the hospital and you're signed in. If you're going in, and if all things being equal, you're able to sign in, or you're asked the question, name, address, blah blah blah, your contact details, and then many of them will say, and your next of kin, you give wife, husband, partner, friend, whatever it is, you identify your own next of kin. First of all, next of kin, there's no such legal thing as a next of kin, actually, under the law. Now you have to have, which you should have always had, but there's been this misunderstanding around a legal entity of a next of kin. People, if they so wish to appoint someone as their next of kin, actually should have what's known as an DPO or an enduring power of attorney. So I can, and this is another good improvement under this new act, the AGM Act, I can appoint someone to be my DPO or enduring power of attorney, but I couldn't say I only want my sister or my brother or whoever to be my enduring power of attorney in relation to financial matters or in relation to my health decision. It doesn't mean I'm giving them the right to be my enduring power of attorney, but it's to all of my life. Does that make sense? But you can make it in relation to parts special. So that's one thing. But when it comes to best interest, a very typical example would be, maybe a parent, if you have a child or somebody with a learning disability might say, well, or with the service provider, they might say, I think it's Jacqui's best interest now if she went and did that course instead of that course, or she that diet or, or had those clothes. So that's people deciding what they believe is in my best interest. And that's a pejorative and very subjective approach. Whereas will and preference now, it's a bit like consultation. Will and preference now is you can't make decisions. You shouldn't be making. Your decisions must involve the person. And that involvement is very clearly, you have to expressly, not assume, expressly get the will, expressed will and preference. When we say expressed, it doesn't have to be verbal, vocal, sign language, or whatever. And you can express will and preference in so many ways. The other area too would be in relation to advanced healthcare directives would be another one. So coming on to the values then of DPO, again, just to describe, because sometimes it's very hard to kind of say to someone, what would a DPO look like or feel like for you? So these are 4 critical values that underpin, if you like, what we're about and what we mean and how we might describe ourselves as DPOs. So we're committed to the human social rights model of disability. So in everything we do, in the way we work, in the way we treat each other, in the way we talk to each other, and the way we try and support each other, we're doing it out from a human rights-based approach. We're doing it from the social rights model of disability as opposed to the medical approach. So we're doing it from the point of view of justice and believing in people have the right to accessible transport, the right to accessible cars, houses, education, employment. So it's that from that basis we're doing this. The second value is that all persons with disabilities without any form of exclusion based on any type of impairment, so it's cross impairment. There's no hierarchy of disability. Sometimes people might attempt to go, oh well, they're a better group than them and they're more able, and so it doesn't matter what your impairment is. So it's cross disability, and as I mentioned earlier, our values will be very much based on equality and respect, and that includes, respect in terms of how anyone identifies for themselves, race, background, ethnic background, and that we can all participate equally, or fear equally and without any fear on the basis of equality. Because we're very clear. Disabled people have the right to talk about disability rights and represent our own issues rather than being represented by others. And that was another thing historically that this does still to some extent. It's improving, but a little. Historically, for years and years and years, particularly in Ireland, we had the disability service providers set up the big charities, and usually because the state abdicated itself with so many responsibilities, it funded organisations, particularly organisations of nuns and priests and brothers, to run services on behalf of the state, and like the St. John of God's, Michael House, they're all saints' names if you look at them. Also to charities, so think of any of those kind of places. Guaranteed, most of them have a saint's name still to this day. And then you have starting to break away from that model a little bit, where things like Disability Federation of Ireland, Federation of Voluntary Service Providers. So it began to kind of dissipate a small bit away from the church. We're still service providers and still are service providers. And for far too long, have spoken on behalf of disabled people, representing disabled people, going into meetings in government departments, with government ministers and elsewhere, speaking in our behalf and talking about our needs. And again, back to that best interest. But what they need is, well, we're not at that table, so we're the ones that should be talking about what we need, not the service providers. We still have a bit of a way to go from that, but we have an awful lot to learn. Now, there are some of the big service providers certainly moving away and being very honest and growing in their honesty and saying, no, we are not a DPO. And that's great. And I heard it again recently. We are not a DPO. So they are supporting, but a long way to go. There are some that would like to take us all over if they could. And there's some running a little bit nervous now and getting afraid because they see and they know change is coming. them, which is no harm. And I think that's good. And that's the value of all of us working together and creating a good voice and a stronger model. So that principle of advocacy, equality, that we are equals, and we deserve to be respected as equals. And that involves being consulted with, nothing about us without us, and you see it there in the end of that slide. So, we have to be allowed and enabled and accommodated and treated equally so that we can participate properly and effectively, which means resources. And obviously it has to be underpinned with respect, be that respect from government department, funders, between ourselves and how we communicate and work together, all those values. So if we get our values right, we'll go an awful long way.
The hierarchy of disability.
Hierarchy of disability in the Western European world in particular would see we'll start at the top. White male, wheelchair user, physical disability, maybe with a professional background or whatever, ready to speak, all those kinds of things, good communicator. So that would typically be a very typical description of somebody at the top of the ladder. Then you might come next to the female version of the male, if you like, and again, somebody with a physical impairment. And then, you come down to the hierarchy kind of operates on colour, and then it operates on type of disability. So typically, and certainly historically, physical disability was the top of the ladder, if you like. And maybe sensory impairment, particularly sensory impairments like visual impairment and hearing impairment, probably visual even ahead of hearing impairment. And you might come down to some of the more hidden type of impairments, and that might include people with other, you probably technically called comorbidity, people who have a number of conditions and things like that. But at the bottom of the ladder, for sure, were people with mental health issues, absolutely for certain. And the second bottom of the ladder, people with intellectual learning disabilities, depending how they self-identify, or who used to be referred to as the mentally handicapped, or SPAS. Sometimes now SPAS also were used for people who were spastic, cerebral palsy and other spasticities. So there are all those kinds of, very definitely, and it's very clear and very distinct. Maybe I'm dreaming, but I do think it's changing. But you are right, Fiona. There is an unconscious bias. I think the other thing is, which still happens, and I would absolutely concur with this one. It's replication of society. The more able of the disabled to get ahead the fastest and the quickest. And sometimes the more able of the disabled leave others behind. So, it's a bit like practice what you preach, or we also need to be mindful of being with those we can and supporting our, friends and colleagues and other people with disabilities, giving them the support to come and join us on the journey. So these are some of the typical attributes of the DPO. Some of them I've already referenced: the local, national, regional, international structure. I'm not going to labour that one anymore. I think you've heard me say that loud and clear. These are important, these attributes. To be a disabled persons organisation, when we're talking about it, we mean that we are a group, an organisation. It can be a tiny group of 4 people. It could be a massive group of 25,000 people. But that our goals and our objectives, and back to that thing of value, that reflect in the convention, the intent of the convention, the rights and the principles in the convention, that they reflect the convention on rights of disabled persons. So, we're not obviously a replication convention, but we have that. That's our backdrop. That's what's guiding us, if you like. If you can imagine it like a shadow behind your back, and guiding and informing maybe your aim, your mission, what you want to achieve as a group or an organisation. So, it's a very useful backdrop to have. Very important attribute of a DPO is it has to be governed by a majority of disabled people. and that's really important. And General Comment 7 goes into great detail, because this was an area with a lot of debate around the world on organisations the majority of organisations of DPOs and the majority. So they went into some good description in General Comment 7, paragraph 13, where they set out 3 subsections of definitions of an organisation of disabled people, so that they are identifying and respecting if parent groups can be considered an organisation, but they'd be like a B, we'd be the A kind of, and particularly, obviously, parents of young children. So that's important that they're recognised. But they're recognised as an organisation of disabled people. Their role is to represent the disabled person, not the parent's needs. They're not coming to it as we're parents and these are our needs, we're carers, these are our needs. That's not a DPO. So it can be a DPO on the basis that they're representing the needs and the voice of the disabled children. So that's what it's about. So it's important, that nuance. And then, as I said already, the majority of members of DPO are disabled people, and that gives us then, and if it's an organisation or group, there's a mandate or an authority given to speak on our own behalf by the members. So membership-led, agreed, on the principles of democracy and with the values of respect and participation and consultation, and that obviously then there's a mandate, and then you have to agree the mandate and what's the way people can speak. What have you agreed to that can be spoken of, saying, well, we are organisation X and the organisation believes X, Y, and Z. Well, how did we come to that agreement? So there's lots of ways to work towards reaching that moment, if you like, and you have to do that through many processes, including by engaging with our members, including sharing information, etc. That whole thing, again, which is actually related to the hierarchy of disability, sharing information and being open and transparent is very important, because that creates respect, bringing those values of trust to the fore. It's not that, school copybook syndrome where you hide your copybook and, I won't share this with anyone. And that's power. And people can be very insidious, or can be very secretive in the way they acquire power for themselves. It mightn't be so overt or open or obvious in some ways. So we always have to be mindful of that.
What does engagement look like?
So what it looks like and feels like, and I'm going to use ILMI even if I may say so, as an example of good practice. ILMI has a weekly bulletin. It's got an open base membership. Obviously, COVID now we know, but it has AGMs open to anyone to come to. It has more and more trying to establish local networks. They run numerous events, particularly online now, so it's very open in that sense. It facilitates dialogue. It runs maybe dialogue on assistive technology. It's got the different working groups. It's got the youth collective, a women's caucus group, that you feel valued, that you can even maybe another way as well, looking that you feel so valued that you could make a suggestion to the organisation you're a member of. I wonder, could we have a discussion on, going night clubbing? I'm only trying to think of something, or a discussion on going, summer's coming, water safety for disabled people or access to the beach and things like that. I'm only just trying to pull out simple examples to think of, and then there's the much bigger things. But I think being valued, included, not afraid to ask questions, and including sharing information. I think if you feel that something's being hidden or coveted from you, I think I'm a great believer. Name it.
Why is there so many disability organisations?
Back in 1992. So not new, and you're quite right around the numbers of our organisation, and so much of that is wrapped up in power, politics, money, and status. Ideally, you would come along with a sweeping brush and get rid of the whole lot and start all over again. But obviously, that's not going to happen. But it's an absolute nightmare. I mean, every time you try to attempt to kind of map out what the disability world landscape looks like, I'd fill the length and breadth and the height of my house with trying in the names of organisations all over the place.
Why do we use the term DPO?
We're using it very clearly to be distinct and distinguish ourselves from being a service provider. So
Yes.
in being a DPO, we're saying we are not delivering services to disabled people on behalf of the state. And I suppose that's the critical piece for me, the meaning behind this.